John, and it's kind of strange in a certain way, but this is year C in our biblical or our liturgical schedule, year C. And year C is dedicated to the Gospel of Mark. But I've told you before, I want to remind you again, that Mark's Gospel is the shortest, with only 16 chapters, and therefore it doesn't go deep enough into some parts of the story of Jesus. And so John's Gospel fills in the gaps and helps us to understand Jesus in a little bit better way. So every 3 years, we have the story of the wedding of Cana, which always follows the Christmas cycle. Now, the wedding at Cana has specific orientation towards the Revelation. The wedding at Cana used to be a part of the Christmas cycle in the old lectionary. So as part of the Christmas cycle, it would every year be explored and made available to the church. So now we only hear the story every 3 years. That's okay, because I think we know the story generally. But now we're going to come at it a little differently, because you're not going to approach it as simply one of those stories that are in the Gospels, but rather as a story that sort of presents the whole Passion story, the whole life of Jesus, in a miniature form to help us set the tone for who is Jesus. So, this is called the first of his signs. So what I want you to know is that until chapter 13, so 1 through 12, are considered the book of signs, okay? In the Gospel of John, the miracles are considered signs. What are they signs of? A sign is something that points to another object somewhere to tell you what's going on. So here, a sign means it's pointing to Jesus and telling you, therefore, this is who he is. Okay? So you have the first of Jesus' sign at Cana in Galilee, and then you'll have 6 other signs along the way that point to who Jesus is. The second part of John's Gospel, which is chapter 13 through 21, is called the Book of Glory. So you have the Book of Signs to begin with and show you who Jesus is, and then the Book of Glory to reveal the fullness of his gift of self and what that means in terms of God's continuing care for us. So, you got these 2 books in John's Gospel. He's got a collection of stories that he has arranged in a certain way to highlight this movement, this gradual revelation of who Jesus is through his signs. And finally, the Book of Glory, which tells us the Last Supper, Good Friday, the time in the tomb, and his post-resurrection appearances. So that's the way we can look at John's Gospel. Any questions? Okay. Yeah.
When you started, you said that we're in year the 3rd year, which is C. Isn't that Luke? Matthew, Mark, Luke? No.
Yeah, you're right.
You said Mark.
I did.
Oh, it is Luke.
It's Luke.
Okay.
Yeah. Big flaw. Okay.
Good catch.
Hope you'll excuse me. Okay, so we have the Gospel, John's Gospel here introduced into Luke's year. Okay, interesting. I didn't realize that, but maybe it completes the Christmas cycle. Okay, let's read it and then we'll talk about it. But just to give you a little advance notice about this story. The story is really not to be considered as, well, we're just telling what happened to Jesus and the events that went on in his life. It's not like that. It's rather that John takes the story that he knows, that he has received from the tradition, and he rewrites it in the way of revealing something about Jesus in a way that, in a new way, in a way that we've never heard before. So let's get out of the mindset, oh, this describes a particular act. It's rather a theological presentation of who Jesus is. Is that good? Okay, let's look at it. Chapter 2. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. When the wine ran short, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, how does your concern affect me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, I'm going to put my other glasses on. His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish ceremonial washings. Each held 20 to 30 gallons. The precise amount was 24 gallons, just so you know. Jesus told them, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it, and when the head waiter tasted the water that had become wine, without knowing where it came from, although the servers who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves good wine first, and then when people have drunk freely, an inferior one. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this at the beginning of his signs in Galilee, in Cana, in Galilee, and so revealed his glory, and his disciples began to believe in him. Go to 11, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Would you get me a napkin?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, does anyone detect something more going on here than just a story about wine, weddings?
It starts out on the third day.
What? Okay. So what does that mean?
There's something big's gonna happen, it's something new.
Okay. So God is going to reveal himself in some stunning new way. Okay, that's the third day. Good. Anything else? It's a clue that there's more going on. Oh, how much you've forgotten.
Well, Father,
Yeah.
it's Mary who goes to Jesus and tells him, so she already knows.
No, there's no Mary in this
Well,
gospel.
his mother.
His mother. Okay.
We know who his mother is, so, yeah.
So Mary, the mother of Jesus, appears here in this first sign, and then she appears at his glory when he is on the cross. She is there as well. Those are the 2 times we see her in this gospel, and she's not called Mary. She's called the mother of Jesus, and that's very deliberate on his part. All right, what else? Yeah.
I find it interesting, you know, and I can think of one mom, because she would have answered the exact same way, which was, you know, Jesus says to her, you know, this does not involve my time has not yet come.
This is
Well,
what?
Mary didn't even listen to it. She said to the servants, do what he said.
Yeah. And so what do you think?
She's a mother, and he's respected her.
All right, two things going on there. One, the familial relationship and his role as an adult male in the family, and probably the adult male in the family. And the other thing is, she has not yet understood the fullness of what Jesus is involved in, but Jesus humbles himself anyway and places himself at her service. So that's a wonderful observation. Are you having trouble hearing me?
It could be my own.
Okay, because my voice is getting weaker, so. Yes.
Father, this is just a question. Why does he call his mother woman and not mom or whatever they?
Well, that's a good question. We'll explore that, yeah. Yeah. Any other observations? So, okay.
Another thought, not so much with Jesus, but about Mary, that occurred a while back, that Mary is so often in the Catholic Church depicted in these, real holy kind of, the statues and the pictures and all of that, and all that, but no buts about it, but I'm sure she was, but in this, they had a wedding, and I think, how do I say it? I think she liked a good time and was aware that they were running out of wine, and we often don't think of her as, we don't know what her personality was like or anything, but here she's aware of that, and
She loves wine.
Yeah.
and likes people.
She's a good Italian woman.
Wanted people to have a good time,
Yeah.
to enjoy themselves.
Okay, so let's describe the wedding feast so that we understand a little bit of this. So the wedding feast was usually a week long. Doesn't mean that people stood around and got drunk and were in a state of drunkenness for a week. It means people came and went. So during the feast, wine would be available for the guests. The groom was responsible for the wine. So the groom here is the one who is contacted when the wine changed. So he's the one who, they thought he brought the wine because the groom is the one who usually brings the wine. But here we know something else is going on, the true wine. Okay, in the context of their wedding feast, the bridal couple would simply stay at home and receive guests. And then everyone would be gathered in the courtyard to celebrate as much as they could. So it was always incumbent on the groom to provide plenty of wine because you didn't want to run short. That was an embarrassment. Now, these events were usually village events, so it brought together all the townspeople and brought them into the celebration and so forth, and visitors from the other village where the bride was from. The responsibility of the guests was just to show up and show themselves having a good time. So there was quite a bit of protocol, quite a bit of organized tradition that had to be followed in terms of setting up a wedding feast. So it was a pretty important development. Now my Bible says that Jesus and his disciples were invited. Does anyone have something else? Do you have invited or?
Yeah, we're all
or were there? Which,
invited.
invited? I mean, that makes a big difference if you crashed a wedding or and drank all the wine so that there was no wine left. That wouldn't portray you in a very good light. So the idea that Jesus was invited and his disciples probably indicates a family wedding. So this was probably a relative of his, and his mother was there, and so on and so forth. And so they had important places in the wedding celebration as part of the family that looked after the bridal couple. So Jesus and his disciples were there. This is almost an indication that some of Jesus' disciples were his brothers. And so you're going to hear in this gospel that there's another group of people that are called the brothers of Jesus. And they don't want him to go to Jerusalem. They are there when he's challenged. And so you hear about this brothers of the Lord. Now, we as Catholics hold that Mary was always a virgin, and so whereas our Protestant brothers and sisters often see these as legitimate blood brothers, we consider them to be cousins, probably other relations in which Jesus had a more complete family life. So not specifically brothers. Even though it'll say his brothers and his disciples, we're going to suggest that some of his disciples were relatives. So they were actually his cousins, or so we imagine. So Jesus and his disciples, as relatives, would be commonly invited to a wedding feast, and we're not just a ragtag group that showed up because Jesus did. Okay? That they were rather part of being there. Okay, now let's look more deeply at the nature of this story. So, what does a wedding feast tell you? When John, the gospel writer, wants to set this first sign within the context of a wedding feast, does that say anything to you? What does it say?
Makes me think of the wedding feast of the Lamb.
Okay, why is it a wedding feast?
The two are brought together, the husband and wife are finally brought together.
All right, and in this
The wedding
context,
feast of the Lamb as being when we are all gathered finally together with God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
so it's a bonding. Yeah. So there's something about it that it's a bonding. Is there anything else?
Food and celebration.
All right, food and celebration. But how is that all connected to the Bible?
Profound love. I mean, love commitment.
Yes.
All right, so we got an image of love. Where is this image from? It's from the Old Testament. You can always say that because everything is from the Old Testament. So the idea of a nuptial relationship, just to go back, nuptial relationship is one that is established by God with his people. And this was true of most of the Semitic people. They saw their lives in relationship to God. And so their role was always to be the spouse of God. Okay? So if that's the nature of my relationship, God who called me to be his bride, which we hear about in the Old Testament, this image, this bridal image, it is the people of God who become the bride to the love of God. who calls them to share in a special espousal. Okay? Write this down, because it's really important. Throughout the Old Testament, the image of the wedding feast is always the image of the fullness of life with God. God and his people joined together in a mutual, giving, sustaining, life-giving relationship that brings forth fruit, that provides for security, that presents God as one who cares for his people as a husband cares for his wife. You've heard that before. I know you've heard that before. So I think it's very important to remember that, especially as we go into this story of a wedding feast at Cana. It wasn't just the miracle of the wine, but it was the miracle of Jesus revealing himself. So in all the stories that we have in John's Gospel, you're going to have Jesus revealing, Jesus saying something about who he really is. And that's the underlying question of John's Gospel. The question is, who is Jesus really? You know, where does he come from, really? All of these matters that are, on the surface, we have a very nice Jewish man who's doing nice things for people and who's speaking great words and he's doing signs and so on and so forth. But who is he really is the question of the gospel. We want to know who he is. And so you'll hear throughout the Gospel of John, you'll hear questions like, well, where do you come from? Because coming from a place gives me an idea of who you are. Who are you? Why is it that you do things like this and others do not? So you'll continue to hear throughout the Gospel of John this question of his identity. And by placing himself here as the provider of the wine, he clearly says, I am the bridegroom. All right? Who's the traditional bridegroom between the people and, God, right? God is the traditional bridegroom of the Old Testament. And so he's going to continue to reveal himself as somebody who provides for his people. You got that? Okay, so the wedding itself, the fact that this was a wedding and not a bar mitzvah or something else, but this was a wedding, indicates that this is meant to be a sign of who Jesus is. Okay? All right, so let's go back into the story, chapter 2 again. Mary brought up the fact that it was after 3 days. Now, some scripture scholars have tried to introduce the concept of the full week of creation, the first 6 days of creation, into these days that are identified here in chapters 1 and 2. But that's a little stretch. I think that it's more important to recognize that the 3 days are related to Sinai. They're related to what God does when he brings new life forth. They're related to God's not taking charge of, but winning his people and bringing them new life. So that's the 3 days in the Old Testament. So keep that in mind as we think about this. This story has lots of references to the Old Testament. Okay. Turn the page too far. All right. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana in Galilee. Anyone been to Cana? Yeah. We've been to Cana. Yeah. You could buy a bottle of wine there to celebrate your wedding. All right. Where did I go? Oh, here I am. All right. When it says Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding, one of the things that we want to remember is that the Messiah comes with his people. And so the disciples would naturally be with Jesus. So we spent the first chapter, Jesus, late in the first chapter, the collecting of those first disciples. And now we have the Messiah traveling with him and introducing to the world who he truly is. Okay. When the wine ran short, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Now, let's talk a little bit about why is Mary not identified, and instead she is called the mother. Any thoughts? Come on, let's have some thoughts. I know your brains are operating. Yeah, Donna.
Could it be that that is her role in the story? She is the mother of Jesus.
Okay.
Why she's there. Otherwise she wouldn't.
All right, let's broaden it a little from that.
Well, only the mother would ask her son to do it, not just Mary, but the mother will ask him.
The mother, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Well, because I think it's important that the mother asked him, not just anybody. The mother asked him.
Well, who's the real mother? Who's the real mother of Jesus? Judaism. Okay? This is the mother. This is the place where God has nurtured a relationship with his people. So if we want to talk about the mother, the person of Mary, she's not in here. But those who represent the outflowing love of Israel, its goodness, its relationship to God, its hopefulness for the future, this is Mary. She represents all that. And she has nurtured Jesus. She's brought Jesus up. She has given Jesus his identity. So this is a way of John claiming Jesus was a true Jew, and he was brought up in the context that Judaism was his mother, and Judaism helped him become the person that he is. And so, in a certain way, John's gospel uses the characters to be symbolic, and he will do so later in the gospel as well. The characters will become symbolic of something more. So when we get to, let's say in chapter 3, we get to the story of Nicodemus. Nicodemus is more than just a leader of his people. He represents something else, something more, and I don't want to get into that now, but he is the something more, and so on and so forth. And through the gospel, John is not afraid to use historical people as symbols of a larger group or symbols of a more complete image of who people really are. That makes sense? So we're going to hear in chapter 19, woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. And it's not a pious little kind of arrangement that Jesus is setting up. It's rather a theological statement about the relationship of the world and the relationship of God and what he does for the sake of the life of the world. rather than just an intimate little setting. Okay? So when he does that, when he says, "Son," I'm realizing as I'm talking, there's no point at which we really talk about this. So I'll just bring it up for now. So, "Son, behold your mother," is like saying, "You of my disciples." You notice this son is not identified either. But he's not called the beloved disciple. He's not called John. He's not called anything. This is an indication that he also represents a group of people, or he's a symbol of something. So the gift of one into the hands of the other is the gift of faithful Judaism and right-thinking Judaism into the hands of the Christian faith, and the Christian faith being handed into the motherhood of Judaism. Okay? So that's John's theology.
So are you saying when someone isn't named in the scriptures to kind of look for a bigger, that's more...
No, I'm saying that in John's gospel, not in the scriptures, but in John's gospel, we can look for more.
Okay.
There's more to be discovered.
Especially if they aren't named?
Yeah.
Is that kind of the caveat? That
Yeah.
If they aren't named, then look that there's a bigger meaning.
Yeah. Or, like, let's just take the name that appears constantly in John's gospel, the beloved disciple. He's never named. He's never called John. He's never called son of Zebedee or anything like that. He's just the beloved. So, is this the name for a person that Jesus had a special affinity for? Or is this the name for all disciples who are faithful to Jesus? And so it could be either one, but we want to leave the possibility open that there's more to it. Okay? All right, how are we doing? Everyone okay? Still paying attention? All right. Okay. So, what do you think it means when the wine failed? If this is highly symbolic, what does it mean that the wine failed?
Big wedding?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of guests?
Mm-hmm. And what happens when the wine fails?
Wedding's over.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, there's nothing else to do here. We might as well go home. The wedding feast has not produced the... So I told you before, let me remind you again, the wedding feast is the greatest event that people will know in a village life. It's the best time that they can have. There's very little other opportunities. There was no Christmas. Sorry. There were no birthdays celebrated. So what did you celebrate? Well, you celebrated the holy days, of course, but you also celebrated the wedding, the village wedding. I mean, it was pretty important in terms of setting people off on the right future, and also for yourselves as having that opportunity to celebrate. And therefore, wine was an important part of the celebration because it brought you to a lighter place rather than the doldrums of daily life. So the wine was poured, the wine ran out. This is a particular sign that the wedding has crashed. Especially since the groom was that's all you had to do as the groom was make sure there was wine. The guy didn't even make sure there was wine. Yeah.
Does that mean, does it mean that the old law is gone and a new beginning is here?
Well, I'm going to say it's related to that, but it's not clearly that. I I mean, Jesus doesn't abrogate the old law. He completes it. So in some way it's to say that the wine was no longer, or the goodness or the flavor or the celebration of the Old Testament had come to a point where it was no longer providing people the hope and the life that they thought it would. And Jesus comes along to bring the new wine of the kingdom. All right? So, then there are these stone water jars there. 6 means 6 stone water jars. All right, let's go back. What does 7 mean?
Completion.
All right. What does 6 mean?
Not quite complete.
That's exactly it. Did you ever wonder why 666 was engraved on the foreheads of those damned in the book of Revelation? 6 is the number of imperfection. All right? So, if 7 is fullness, or 7 is completeness, or perfection, 6 is less than that. So the 6 stone water jars were used for Jewish purification rituals. So we know it's a Jewish wedding. Now, what was the Jewish purification rituals? They had to wash their hands up to their elbows and wash their necks and it's more of it wasn't to clean you, it was to make you, what's the word? Make you available to God's presence. So it was a cleansing that was done typically brought into Judaism through Pharisaism. First, Pharisaism began this introduction of purity rites to the faith of Israel. So at this point, there are 6 stone water jars. Now, why are they stone? Do you know? Stone cannot be contaminated. Stone remains pure. And so even if polluted things are poured into the stone, and I'm talking about ritual, I'm not talking about earthly objects, science. I'm talking about ritually unclean. It doesn't make the vessel unclean because it's stone, and stone is like the ground. And so, therefore, to make jars out of stone was to provide places where the water would be cleansed, would be pure. So, here we've got 6 stone water jars. It doesn't say that they have anything in them. And they are stone, meaning that they can contain the fullness of God's purity. Okay? Now take those and go over there and fill them with water. So I'd like to think that the miracle is not simply that water becomes wine, but that Jesus begins to reveal who he is. That's the real miracle. So the water brought back in the 6 stone water jars is now transformed to wine. Now let's look at this from the larger perspective. What happens to the wedding?
After the wine is
changed,
it
yeah.
goes on.
Yeah, okay. And because the wine is the best, what are you going to expect? People are going to stay around. People are going to enjoy themselves. People are going to have a glass or 2 or 4 or 8. And it's going to be a fuller experience, a richer experience, maybe. I mean, that's the promise. It's not necessarily what will happen. But given the image of this new wine, new hope, new renewal of the wedding. The fuller life is guaranteed, so on. Now, can you see that within a religious context? Can you see how the wedding becomes a metaphor for a life with God? So that's what we're really aiming at here is, what is life with God, and who helps us, who helps to provide it? Well, Jesus is Lord. I mean, he's the one who comes and brings the new wine, the wine of the kingdom. Okay? We doing all right?
Yes, sir.
Bored? You heard this before? Okay, yeah.
I'm also struck by that there's action involved.
Mm-hmm.
That Jesus didn't wave a magic wand and
Mm-hmm. God,
cases
you know,
of
and
wine.
that's one of the, I think there's an important theological element in that. God uses intermediaries. He doesn't simply do things himself. He asks others to participate in his signs. So in this sign, we have people who are active. Yeah, people who are doing something. People who are engaged in the process. Okay, yeah.
You know, the people, we have the advantage of listening to you and understanding a different way of what this means.
Yeah.
Now, to the people of the time, it probably had no meaning other than good wine.
Probably. And that somewhere in this miracle is this idea that Jesus is revealing himself. So somehow they want to see him. I mean, he wants that they understand he's the true groom of God's people. But we would probably imagine that most of the people just went home happy. They had no deeper understanding than that. But for those who are there and those who are watching all this unfold, there's a true revelation that's going on. All right, we got the 24-gallon water jars. Jesus told them, fill the jars with water, so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, draw some out now, take it to the head waiter. So they took it to the, and when the head waiter tasted it, thinking that the groom was responsible for the bride, or for the wine, he calls the groom over and tries to understand what is the meaning of this. And so, called the bridegroom, and the waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone who serves the good wine first. All right, so we're going to indicate the quality of the wine and the fact that Jesus is the best wine of the kingdom. And they have kept the good wine until now. So Jesus did this as the beginning of his signs in Cana in Galilee, and so revealed his glory, and his disciples began to believe in him. Now it's important, that last statement, to see that the disciples had some idea who this man was, who was somehow connected with Messiahship and the new kingdom of God and so on and so forth. But what they understand and what they know at this point is pretty minimal, because they're going to go through some hard revelations as this story continues. Okay, is that good? All right, let's take a break. Okay. I can't raise my voice. Hey!
Hey guys, we're gonna start again. I'll be your voice raiser for you.
Hi, Bun. Well, it was just to get people, they gave people the good wine so that people would think, oh, this is a pretty classy wedding. They have nice wine. And then the more you drink, what? As you go to the wedding later, there's less attention on the wine and more attention on the carousing. You can stay away from the wedding. The Egyptians had beer. Yeah, going all the way back, I think 2000 BC, they crafted beer. So you could go to Egypt and drink beer.
So you don't go to the wedding?
No, but I like dancing.
Or you could go to Germany where they like beer.
You can be the designated driver.
All right, we're looking at the book of the prophet Isaiah. Yeah.
Okay. Back to the wedding. I was just struck this time by other wedding stories in the Gospels have to do with a wedding, all prepared.
Yeah.
Lots of wine, lots of food, and nobody comes.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting contrast.
Yeah, just using, I mean, the idea is that you use the image of the wedding feast as an indication of God's kingdom. So when you look at that in terms of its relationship to other stories in the gospel, it's all about God's kingdom and being invited into God's presence. All right, we're looking at Isaiah 62. Yeah.
So the writers seem to layer so much meaning in the writing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a characteristic of writers at that time, or were we just fortunate that the people whose records we have were some of the best writers?
Well, human beings have always been metaphoric. So from the dawn of writing, we've had to portray our experience with some kind of description that's a metaphor. So for the people of those days, the metaphor of the kingdom, of God's kingdom, what had to be like a wedding feast. So it's just using a human trait, a human characteristic, let's say, as part of our way of expressing ourselves. We use metaphors. We tell people what things are like. All right? Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, 62. And you're going to recognize this because we've had it before. Oh, let's go back first of all and talk about, remember the division of Isaiah. And remember the historical circumstances that pertain to those divisions. So if we're looking at Isaiah 62, we're looking at the third part, right?
Yes.
Third part of the book of the prophet Isaiah. And the overwhelming or the overarching theme of the first part is what? First part of Isaiah.
Oh, first part was
Yeah.
the Assyrian captivity? Or
What?
Assyrian,
No, not Babylon.
Assyria.
Assyria. So remember, Assyria has come down from the north with its battle troops and has conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. There are 10 tribes in that geographical area. What Assyria often did was to send the people to live in other colonies. That way they wouldn't cause any, political disruption. They would just succumb. So that's why we call the 10 tribes of Israel, Israel being the northern kingdom, the lost 10 tribes, because they were dispersed. Okay? That was, does anyone know the date? All right, all I want you to do is remember the 8th century. 8th century Assyria, 6th century for Babylon. Now, it wasn't a full 200 years, but it's important to get that time frame right. Assyria conquered the north, went all the way down into Egypt, conquered the whole Mediterranean coast, except for Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel. And they held them at they had to pay a fee so that they could exist. But they perdured, and they paid their fee, and they paid their, what is that called? Tribute, okay. So they paid their tribute, and they were able to establish themselves in a quasi-independent way, not a whole independent way. But anyway, they managed to maintain their individualism. Now, the religion, because it was lost in the north, was focused in the south, and it became focused around Jerusalem and the community of the south that was centered in Jerusalem and the environments there. So, then in 596, the Babylonians began their conquest of the Holy Land. So they began to move into the Assyrian population and to begin to overpower all the nations. And they were the superpower of the East then. So it was Assyria in the 8th century, and then the very beginning of the 6th century, you have the beginning of the Babylonians and their conquest. Okay, keep those in mind. The Babylonians did their best to tolerate the Israelis, but, well, they weren't Israelis, but they were Judeans, Judahites. And, but after 10 years and constant skirmishes and constant uprising, Babylon decided to come in and squash the southern kingdom of Judah. So in 596, 597, they began to deport some of the people from Israel to Babylon. And this was this was the first Babylonian conquest. But it wasn't until 587, so 10 years later, with the constant uprising of Israel, they decided to move in with their armies and squash Israel, or Judah, completely. Am I making sense?
Yes.
All right. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page with this. Okay, the prophet Isaiah 1-39 is about generally, and I can't say completely because it's mixed, but it's generally about this experience of the Assyrians and their attempt to conquer Judah. So the Assyrians who are coming down from the north. And this prophet offers his consolation and hope and helps them to understand why this is happening. And then his time comes to an end somewhere, we don't know where, but before 587. 587 is the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem, and the deportation, the final deportation of the Israelites to Babylon. So the second part of Isaiah picks up, generally speaking, I say generally speaking because there are certain chapters and certain certain sections of chapters that are obviously pertaining to some other historical time. So you'll see in that first description, chapters 1 through 39, you'll also see references to Babylon. And you'll say, well, why is Babylon in there? And what I have to remind you again is that this is a mixed document. That somebody finally put it all together later on, much later after the return. So, and then they weren't sure of the historical details, or it wasn't clear to them exactly how this all unfolded, and they did the best they could to put into the books, the 3 books of Isaiah, the unfolding events as they occurred, okay? But they weren't always accurate. All right, so 2nd Isaiah 40 through 55 is about the people living under the Babylonian yoke and being oppressed and in a foreign land. So we know that this Isaiah wrote from the experience of being exported and is reflecting to the people a kind of hopefulness that God will return and rebuild the nation. Okay? So around 537 or so, you have Cyrus of Persia arise from the ancient world, ancient Near East, and he's going to release the people and send them back to their home. So you hear about this both in Isaiah 2 and then the completion of that act is in Isaiah 3. But you hear about Cyrus as the great champion of the people, the great Messiah, the one who comes along to liberate the people from Babylon so that they can return to their homeland. So this is when Persia arises as the new power, the new dominant power. And then after the Persians and their incursion and dominance of the Middle East, then the Greeks come in, okay? So the Greeks come in 300s BC. Before that, it's the Assyrians. And after the Greeks, you have the Romans, okay? Just a little reminder of the history. So, when we come to chapter 62 in the book of the prophet Isaiah, we're dealing with a time period of, okay, the promises have come through. They're inviting us to return to our land. Cyrus of Persia has come through and provided for this opportunity, but we don't want to go back. Or we're not quite sure what awaits us. And so given the problems of that, there's a reluctance on the part of Israel to return to Zion. Zion being the place where God dwells with his people in Jerusalem. So the author of the 3rd section of Isaiah wants to encourage his people to return to their land, to rebuild, and to... By the way, can you imagine the rebuilding that has to take place in Gaza? Holy Toledo. Anyway, so you can imagine what it was like for Israel to have to say, why wouldn't we want to go back there? Our homes are here, etc., etc. So Isaiah, the 3rd part of Isaiah, offers them hope and confidence in God's redeeming love. So some of the people have returned, some of the people are in the process of returning, some of the people are thinking about returning. You have this restoration of the ancient land. Okay? Yeah.
My understanding too is that Israel is the only example in the ancient Near East of a nation being completely destroyed and sent into exile, then being restored to its homeland with its religious traditions intact. You do not find any evidence of that happening with any other group.
Oh, interesting. They must.
Mackenzie talks about that in his commentary on Isaiah. It was absolutely historically unprecedented.
There's a fierceness about their loyalty to their identity and as God's people that pertains throughout the Old Testament. This fierce sense of this is who we are.
When you're saying that, I'm just thinking if they've been gone from that homeland, gone from their temple, gone from the rituals, gone from everything that made their religion kind of communal, it's interesting that they would go back.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they kind of lost everything that was part of the ritualistic,
Yeah.
going to the temple stuff has been gone.
Yeah,
for 7
that change in religion was important in terms of what happened to the faith, in terms of a turn from sacrificial offerings to a turn to the law and the writings.
So was the fact that Cyrus would give them money to kind of encourage them to go back part of
I
the
don't know
covenant?
what Cyrus did, but the sense was they were free to go. But, it's hard to convince people who've been living 50 years in some place to go someplace else now that they don't know. So, I don't know. Very interesting. Okay, let's read 62, 1-5. For Zion's sake, I will not be silent. Now, we don't know who's speaking, and that's okay. But who is Zion? For Zion's sake, I will not be silent. Who is Zion?
Israel.
Okay? But remember, it's the redeemed Israel. It's the glorified Israel. It's the Israel that has been restored to God's faithfulness, God's grace. So it's not just any old Zion, any old land, but it's a restored land. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not keep still. So remember that Jerusalem, the head or the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom, retains its importance as the symbolic center of God's people. For Jerusalem's sake, until her vindication shines forth like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. So one of the images you're going to find frequently in Scripture is the image of light. And so the burning torch and the morning dawn become symbols of new light, and light is directly related to God's presence in their lives. So, till her vindication shines forth like the dawn. Dawn is Zorah, Z-O-R-A, and her salvation like a burning torch. Nations shall behold your vindication. All kings, your glory. Okay, now what's important here is we're setting this group of people up for a new role in the story of salvation. So if you remember before, the issue was maintaining its ritual purity, maintaining its identity, maintaining its own individual scope. Well, what's going to happen to us? How are we going to survive? Et cetera, et cetera. Now the voice is telling the people to look up, there's more for you to do. And you are going to be part of this whole story of salvation. So get ready. You're not to sit in the background. All right. You shall be called by a new name. And the name is the reputation, okay? So you'll have a new reputation, bestowed by the mouth of the Lord. You shall be a glorious crown in the hand of the Lord, a royal diadem in the hand of your God. Does everyone have diadem? Okay. Does everyone know what a diadem is?
It's a small crown.
Yeah. Okay. So the people are going to be lifted up and become gloriously new. All right. No more shall you be called forsaken, or your land called desolate. Where am I here? Long chapter.
I think you need to turn one more page, maybe. Oh, wait, here we go. 62.
Okay. So, oh, it's up here. Oh, it's
This
up
is
here.
4.
Okay.
So
61 or 62.
It's
All right.
here. Yep.
All right.
And your readers are right there.
Yeah. Better get my readers. Okay. So the new name is an indication of a new creation and not just a label, but becomes the identity. Your identity is fundamentally changed. You shall be a glorious crown in the hand of the Lord, in God's hands, a royal diadem held by your God. So your God is going to crown you and reward you until you become something great and new. No more shall they call you forsaken, which is Azubah, or your land desolate, which is Samama, and you will be called my delight, which is Hephzibah, and your land espoused, which is Beulah. And for the Lord delights in you and makes your land his spouse. And that's an important image that is used throughout the Semitic world. People were always married to their God. And so marriage, like we hear in the wedding at Cana, marriage is an emblem or a symbol of that relationship that exists between God and his people. And so Jesus comes in the wedding feast as the true groom. He brings the true wine. He comes to espouse himself to his people. But this was also true in Babylon and true in Assyria and true in the lands of the Canaanites. This image of the wedding and the relationship between a spouse, between a bride and a husband, becomes a paramount image of God's relationship and protection and care for and overseeing of his people, which is why we get the common phrase or refrain, I am a jealous God. Okay? I'm a jealous God because I have a spousal relationship to you, not just a casual relationship, but I'm totally for you, and you must be totally for me. So that's why other gods were considered to be the worst kind of sin on Israel's part. The worst sin was to give your allegiance and your loyalty and your life to something that is not permanent, not holy, and not God. So the wedding becomes a symbol of God's relationship to his people. Okay? As a young man marries a virgin, your builder shall marry you. And as a bridegroom rejoices in his bride, so shall your God rejoice in you. So this is going to be similar to Isaiah 60, which also uses some of these themes as well. The idea of a restoration of a new life, and God's becoming the groom again to his people who are his bride. Okay? Now we have to look at, where's my list?
1 Corinthians.
Oh, 1 Corinthians, yeah. 1 Corinthians, which is in itself a whole lesson, and I only have 10 minutes or so. Okay, just to remind you of the journeys of St. Paul, he comes to Corinth because he's had to escape from this northern region here. So he leaves Thessalonica, goes to Berea, comes down the coast, stops in Athens. He seems to have failed in Athens. He gets a few converts, but being the center of the ancient world, it was really a disappointment. He goes down to this particular Ichthus, or backwards little area, and the city of Corinth, which is the major port between the routes that come from the west. They come from the west, and they come from the east, and they go through Corinth. And Corinth becomes then a center for the spread of the faith. Okay, he goes to Corinth, spends a couple years there. He's a tent maker, doing what he does. He leaves, goes back to Ephesus and to Jerusalem, and then he writes back to Corinth because they're having problems, and so his writing to them is his advice to them in terms of how they are to manage their communal affairs. There's a page in here. Thank you. All right, chapter 12. Verses 4 to 11. There are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit. There are different forms of service, but the same Lord. There are different workings, but the same God who produces all of them in everyone. To each individual, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for some benefit. To one is given through the Spirit the expression of wisdom. To another, the expression of knowledge, according to the same Spirit. To another, faith, by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing, by the one Spirit. To another, mighty deeds. To another, prophecy. To another, discernment of spirits. To another, varieties of tongues. And to another, interpretation of tongues. But the one and the same Spirit produces all of these, distributing them individually to each person as he wishes. Okay, this is a familiar a familiar image or tropos, the body as a unified reality with its parts doing their things that it has to do. This comes from the polis, and the polis is the public citizenry in, it comes from the government. So this image of a body with parts that has to serve by managing all the parts working together in a kind of unity is a piece that has been publicly described as politics. This is what it means to be a politic. It means to be a people that are joined together in this kind of thing. Paul takes the image of the politic and he makes it a religious thing. So he begins to talk about, and he will refer to this again in Romans, and then again, I think, in Galatians. He will refer to this image of the body as an important tropos for his Christian church. So Paul is writing back to a community now that has fractioned, and that is divided because of different concepts, different moralities that rise up, different ideas about the resurrection and the dead. And this fractioning has caused Paul to kind of panic and send back this letter to urge them to put aside their differences and to begin to find some commonality with each other, so that one of his very first Christian communities doesn't end up as a failure. So it's very important for him to get them to see that they are a unity, but they've got to overlook their differences. And one of the ways to see their differences is to see them as organs of a single body. And by recognizing that they have to work together, they can become a better Christian community. So he uses a political metaphor, the image of the body. He transfers it to the body of Christ, and he's used it as he will use it in Galatians. He will use it in Romans. It's not an unfamiliar concept to people, and let's put Christ at the center of this and say that we're all members of him, and we have different roles.
Well, I think it tells us that we are all equal, and nobody should look up or down to anybody, because we all contribute in one way or another that's important to the society.
There's a certain sense of that's true in the in Paul's emphasizing his parts of the body, that he will talk about later on, the essential parts. And he will say that, some parts that are considered lowly and unimportant are really extremely important in terms of the body. So we're not going to miss out on that. Anyone else? Yeah.
Father, could you just give us a little bit of insight into the differences between wisdom and knowledge?
Okay, knowledge is about facts and having lots of information available to you. Wisdom is being able to order your life, to order things in priority, to order behaviors that are related to what you think is important. So that's the difference. So.
Father, wisdom is how to use your knowledge. How to use it in the right way.
Yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. What other questions? Any other questions? Then we shall be adjourned.
Thank you, Father.
You're welcome.